Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at allowing a user to log in by querying a database for the user's username and password. So the idea is to support this tutorial, and this really is just a tutorial on querying databases, but for the sake of this tutorial I've created a login.jsp, which, let's take a look at that, which looks like this. And this is just using some simple HTML and a little bit of CSS. And as I've said before, like HTML and CSS is really outside the scope of this tutorial. But the guts of this stuff, the stuff that actually does stuff, is it's stuff that we've looked at in previous tutorials. So I've got a form with the method set to post and the action set to an encoded URL. We have the context path in here, and that goes to a controller servlet that I've created with the action set to do login. And on the form itself we've got a text control and a password control and a just a button to submit it with, and there's also a space to put a error below the little sort of login table. In case the user can't log in, we can inform them of that fact. And I've formatted this stuff by putting it in an HTML table. So we've got some rows here with the TR tag and table cells with the TD tag, and that's formatted using a bit of CSS. Now, if you don't know HTML and CSS and you want to be able to create these kinds of things yourself, of course you're most welcome to use this code here from this tutorial, and you can find this code attached to the tutorial series. But you could hire a web designer just to create static web pages, which you can then make dynamic using these techniques. Or of course you could follow our tutorial yourself on HTML and CSS, and it's simpler than Java, so if you can handle Java you should have no problem with HTML and CSS. Although it definitely is, web design is clearly a separate sort of discipline to programming. So I've got that, and I've also got a login success form, which just basically says you are logged in, and it uses an attribute to echo the username's email address. And so I've got my controller servlet here that just handles all that. It shows the login form, and it gets a database connection using a data source, as we saw in a previous tutorial. And the bit that we're going to implement in this tutorial is if the user submits the form, we want to say either if the user's password and username can be found in a database, we want to go to the login success page, and if it can't, we want to go back to the form. So everything that I've done here I've showed you in previous tutorials, apart from a bit of HTML design there, and now we're going to look at the kind of database part of this. So to do that, I'm going to create a new class which is going to deal with authenticating users. And actually there's a couple of things that I just want to briefly mention at this point. And one is that a lot of application servers, for instance Tomcat, have a built-in authentication mechanism that you can use with your database. But to configure that, it's basically a lot of XML, and it wouldn't help us to kind of learn database stuff here. So I'm not going to cover that in this series of tutorials, I don't think. And this way of doing it gives us maximum flexibility, and once you understand all this stuff, the kind of servlet stuff, JDBC stuff, and login, and kind of JSP stuff, then this way is actually quite straightforward and very flexible. Another thing to mention is that in a proper kind of login system, you probably want to store the user's username in the session to keep them logged in once they've logged in successfully. And I'm not going to cover that here because you can easily put that together using the stuff we've covered in previous tutorials. So let's get on now and look at actually querying the database. And I'm going to create let's create a new Java class. So I'll right click my project and create a new class here, and I'm going to call this, let's call it account. That will do, and I'll put that in a package called database, and I don't want a main, of course, and I'll click finish. And for a start, let's say that account has a constructor that takes a database connection. So I'll say public account and account, and that can take a connection object con, and it'll just say in here this.con equals con, and to make that work I need an instance variable private connection con, like that. So absolutely normal standard Java, and I'm going to import java.sql.connection here. And let's also give it a method, public boolean, let's say login, and that's going to accept a string email and a string password. And for the moment, let's just say return true. And before we go any further, let's just wire this into my controller. So up here, if the user, if the action is do login, that means that they've submitted the login form, because I've got on this login form, login.jsp here, in the form I've got a hidden input control with the name action and the value do login. So let's go to controller, and in the do post method here I've got this code that checks for the action do login, and I'm going to say here, let's say user, sorry not user, account ac equals new account. In fact, let's just call it account just to make it clear, and I'm going to pass the database connection to that, which I got earlier on up here, just using a data source, so ds.get connection there, and add the import there, Control Shift O, and there we go. And so now I want to say the user submitted their email address and password, and I want to say if account.login, and I want to pass the email here and the password. So if login successful, I'll return true there, and then I'll say get request.dispatcher. I'll say request.getRequestDispatcher, and I'll forward to login success.jsp. Else, if they can't be logged in, I'm going to say request.setAttribute. I'm going to set a message attribute, because that's retrieved in my login page, and that's going to set some sort of message about them not being able to log in. So I'll say here email address or password not recognized, and that's going to end up being echoed below the table right here, just with a request.get attribute. And I'm then going to forward here to login.jsp again, so we'll go back to the login page, of course, and let them have another go at typing their information, their details. So let's just check that, see if it works. So I'm going to run, I've created an index.jsp, and I've just got a link on it to the login form, and let's take a look. Click here to log in. So at the moment the account.java always returns true for login, so I should be able to log in here no matter what I type in here, and I'll click, I'll type some rubbish in there, but here I'll put something meaningful, because that's going to actually, our login page here, login success page, will actually echo back this email address, so using a request.get attribute, and I'll log in, and it says you are logged in, john@caperprogramming.com. Now let's put the real code in there that actually checks to see if the user is allowed to log in. And the first thing I'm going to do is I need to create a prepared statement, and a prepared statement in JDBC is it's kind of a class that encapsulates the SQL statement, and the SQL statement and then that class can actually be reused. But the great thing about it is that you can use wildcards with it, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But I'm going to say prepared statement, let's call it stnt equals, and I'm going to say con.create create statement. I think that's right. So should be a create prepared statement here, and I'm not seeing it, but oh yeah, actually it's con.prepare statement. So prepare statement, and I can pass this some SQL. So let's pass in there. In fact, let's have a string called SQL. So I'll say it up here, and let's add the import for prepared statement with Control-Shift-O. So it's tempting to add this MySQL prepared statement, but I actually want java.sql.prepared statement. So just go for the vanilla standard versions here, or you'll have problems. And I'll say here string SQL equals, and now we can type some SQL in there that's going to query on the username and password and see if it exists in the database. So I've got this database table created in MySQL in my database, and it's got an email and a password column in it, and the table's called users. So I'm going to say select count star, let's say count star. So I just want to count the number of rows returned. So I'll say select count star from users, where email equals, and here I'm going to use a question mark. This is a wildcard, a JDBC wildcard, where email equals question mark and password equals question mark. And when I've done that, I can prepare the statement. Now I need to handle an exception here. So let's surround a try catch. And in fact, it's probably easier if I just throw a SQL exception here. I'll say throws SQL exception, and then I could decide in my code that actually is going to call this method in my connect.code how to handle that, whether to show an error page or something like that. But for the moment, let's just see if I can surround the whole thing with a try catch here, like that. And so here I could put some sensible error handling code, but I'm just gonna put a comment for a moment, do something sensible here, forward to error.jsp, etc. And I'll also let's leave in that e.print stack trace in case something does go wrong. I'd like to be informed of it. So now if I go back to my account.java, so we created a prepared statement, and now I need to fill in these wildcards with actual data, and the way to do that is I say statement dot set string, set string down here, and now these wildcards are numbered starting at number 1. So I want to set the first wildcard, which is 1, to email, and I'm going to set the second wildcard, which is going to be 2, to password. Now what this is, I'm actually not going to reuse this statement here. So that kind of aspect of prepared statements we're not going to draw on here, but beginners often kind of attempted to concatenate things like this email directly into a statement like this. So you could say, you could have a closing quote there and say plus email plus, and then open a quote here. Whatever you do, don't ever do that, and the reason for it is that that opens you up to SQL injection attacks, because someone could type a load of SQL in this email address that could drop your database or something like that. So if you use wildcards, your data will be automatically escaped and surrounded by quotes or whatever needs to happen to it for it to run within the SQL will be done, and special characters won't break it, and SQL injection attacks won't work. And so it's just a much nicer way of doing it, and much safer if you use wildcards like this than if you had concatenated your email and password directly into the SQL, which you should never do. Now once we've done that, we can execute the query. So I can say, and actually also let's say here as count, I'll give it a name, although I'm not sure if I'm actually really going to use that, but let's say here statement dot execute query, because we're querying the database, so we need to execute query, and that returns an object of type result set. So I'm going to say result set, I'll just call it rs equals statement.execute query, and I'll add the input there, Control-Shift-O. And now when you get your result set back, it has kind of an internal pointer that's positioned before the first result, and to move it on to the first result you have to say rs dot next. There we go. And I'm going to say if, because that will return false if there aren't any results. So just to be on the safe side, although there should always be a result here, even if it's 0, that should be fine, because I'm getting a count. I'll say if results rs.next, the result set.next. And if we get rs.next, now I can say rs.get, and we'll use get int here, and you can either put here a column name or an index, and the index would be like an index into your, like this would be index, the first column's 1, so this will be index 1 here, but I'm going to use the name of it because I've given it a name. I've said select count star as count, so let's say here count, and that should return me, using this SQL is going to return me a count of users in my database that have that email and that password. So I'll say here int count equals, and now finally if I've got this all right, I can say if count equals 0, then return false. And I could say that else return true, but I've got to return true down at the bottom here, so that should be fine. Now there's a couple of things that you really must remember, and one is that you need to make sure that you're closing a connection, but we're doing that in controller.java. We also need to get rid of your dispose of your result set. So I'll say here, actually let's take this int count maybe outside this if, and I'll say int count equals 0 by default, and let's say here if we've got results I'll set count to rs.getCount, and then finally here I can say if count equals 0 return false, else return true, like this. Control-Shift-F there to format my code. So all we're doing is retrieving this value from one value from the database basically, and if we've got a count, if that user exists, we will return true to say that they can be logged in successfully. And now here the point of doing that was that I just want to say rs.close here, because you want to close your statements, otherwise the resource kind of hangs around in some kind of a fashion. Now that should all work in theory if I've got this correct. So let's take a look. Let's go to index.jsp and click run. Now in my database I've got a couple of users here, and in particular I've got john@caveofprogramming.com with the password let me in here. So let's try that. Let's say john@caveofprogramming.com and let me in here, and click log in, and it's said that I'm logged in. But if we go back and type the wrong password and click log in, email address or password not recognized, or if I type the right password, so let me in here, and submit that, so that's fine. if I go back, oh actually it's forgotten my password, I forgot I didn't tell the form to save the password, but I'll type it again, let me in here. And if I have some wrong password, some wrong email address as well, then it won't let me in either. So that's it for this tutorial, just a really simple login form. And the main purpose of this actually was, we didn't really look at any new form stuff, but the main purpose of that was to show you this really simple, well, it's a comparatively simple way of querying a database using JDBC. And so that's it for this tutorial. Join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.